In the northeast of China, the land once called Manchuria. At the edge of a vast plain stretching to the horizon, there are ruins. Wooden beams collapsed. Grass covering what was once a floor. Only the traces of someone who once lived here remain. 270,000 people. Japanese farmers who were made to believe in a dream on the continent and crossed to this land. Until the summer of 1945, they lived here. This video follows how they lived and how they were lost. At the end, we will show you historical photographs from that era, colorized using AI. Let us begin. In 1930s Japan, rural villages were gripped by extreme poverty. The waves of the Great Depression struck Japan's farming communities hard. The price of raw silk collapsed to less than half its former value. In the villages of Nagano and Yamagata, once known as the Land of Silk, families began selling their daughters into domestic service or brothels. Second and third sons had no land to inherit. For tenant farmers, the dream of owning their own fields seemed utterly out of reach. And the government offered one answer: go to Manchuria. On the night of September 18, 1931, an explosion occurred near the South Manchuria railway tracks, outside Mukden, in the northeast of China. Japan's Kwantung army declared it a Chinese act of sabotage and launched military operations the next day. But the explosion had been staged by the Kwantung army's own officers. It was so small that a train passed right over the site moments later. The invasion that began through deception swept through the major cities of northeast China within months. On March 1, 1932, the state of Manchukuo was proclaimed. Puyi, the last emperor of the Qing dynasty, was installed as regent, and later as emperor. But all real power was held by the Kwantung army. Even cabinet decisions required the army commander's approval. Puyi later recalled, "I was nothing but a puppet of the Kwantung army." The League of Nations declared the action illegitimate and refused to recognize Manchukuo. Japan withdrew from the League the following year. This new state, Manchukuo, was promoted by the Japanese government as a paradise of harmony among 5 races: Japanese, Han Chinese, Manchu, Mongolian, and Korean peoples would build a new nation together. So read the posters displayed in village offices and schools across the country. The pamphlets promised: each household will receive 10 hectares of their own farmland. A prosperous life for generations to come. For farmers who could not even own a single quarter-acre of land, 10 hectares sounded like a dream. In 1936, the government announced a plan to send 1 million households to Manchuria over 20 years. Quotas were assigned to every town and village. Local teachers and village headmen became recruiters. For your country. For your family's future. No one said, "You may never come back." For young men in farming villages, a separate program was established. It was called the Manchuria-Mongolia Youth Volunteer Corps. And it targeted boys still in middle school, the youngest were 14 years old. Under the pretext of agricultural training, they were sent to remote border farmlands, assigned to clear land close to the front lines. Between 1938 and 1945, approximately 86,000 boys were sent to Manchuria. Nagano Prefecture sent the largest number of migrants in the entire country. Approximately 33,000 people. Farmers from this mountain prefecture, once prosperous in silk, had lost their livelihoods in the economic collapse and sought a new frontier in Manchuria. They accounted for roughly 1 in 10 of all Japanese migrants. 270,000 agricultural migrants. 86,000 young volunteers. They believed the government's promises and crossed to the continent. The settler villages were Japan transplanted whole. Each had a shrine, an elementary school, an agricultural cooperative. Villages were often named after the towns they had left behind. Ohinata village in Nagano's Minamasako district saw over 30% of its residents emigrate. They built a second Ohinata on the Manchurian plain. There were Bon-Odori festivals, sports days, the laughter of children. Up at 5 in the morning to work the fields of soybean, sorghum, and wheat. Evenings gathered around the table beside a coal-burning stove. No running water, drawn by hand from a well. Summers were brief. Winter in northern Manchuria could drop below -30 degrees Celsius. For second and third sons born into Japanese farming families, men who had given up hope of ever owning land. The fields of the continent were indeed vast. To till one's own land, for one's own family. There were those who genuinely realized that dream here. But for the boys who came as volunteers, daily life was something else entirely. What was called agricultural training was in reality beatings from their superiors and brutal labor. Unaccustomed farm work. Unsanitary conditions. Spreading disease. The letters they wrote home could not tell the truth. "I'm doing fine," so they wrote, while saying nothing of what was real. Those who returned home later all told the same story. But the prosperity of the settler villages was built on a foundation that ignored the land's own history. Much of the land set aside for Japanese settlers had been farmland that Chinese and other families had cultivated for generations. The Manchuria Colonization Corporation purchased this land by force, at roughly 10% of market value, even less for supposedly uncultivated plots, and expelled the inhabitants to designated collective settlements. 20 million hectares. Approximately 14% of Manchuria's total land area was seized in this manner and distributed to Japanese settlers. The Chinese farmers who had lost their land had no choice but to work as day laborers on the outskirts of the very villages built on their fields. Inside Manchukuo, the forced mobilization of Chinese workers was routine in the coal and iron mines and military factories. A law enacted in 1937 gave authorities the legal basis to conscript workers by force. Many were made to work in appalling conditions, falling gravely ill with no access to medical care, and dying. The society beneath the 5 races in harmony posters was in reality a rigid racial hierarchy with Japanese at the top. Many of the ordinary farmers who came to settle were not politicians or generals at the apex of power. They were ordinary people, trying to escape the poverty of rural Japan. They tilled their fields, raised their children, held their festivals, doing nothing more and nothing less than that. But the land on which they built their new lives had been taken from someone else's home. Late at night on August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. And in the early hours of August 9, an army of 1.5 million men poured into Manchuria from 3 directions. 3,700 tanks. More than 3,700 aircraft. On the first day alone, units advanced more than 15 kilometers. Within 5 days, they had penetrated 150 kilometers into the interior. By August 20th, nearly every major city had fallen. The Kwantung Army had by this point already transferred its elite units to the Pacific Theater. What remained was mostly undertrained recruits and aging soldiers. The fearsome force once called the Guardian of Manchuria no longer existed, and the Kwantung Army abandoned the settlers. On August 10th, the military began evacuating the families of officers to the cities, while simultaneously cutting telegraph lines to the countryside and blowing up bridges. No warning reached the remote settler villages. Records remain of a telegram sent from one headquarters to the leaders of a settlement. There is no choice but to die by your own hand. In most of the settlements, the fathers were already gone. In the final stages of the war, the Kwantung army had conscripted virtually every able-bodied man from the farming villages. What remained were mothers, children, and the elderly. They began to flee with whatever they could carry. Through soybean fields, through walls of sorghum, into the snowy plain. Chased by Soviet soldiers. Assaulted. Dying of hunger and cold. In settlements where flight was impossible, mass suicides occurred. At Ganjenmyo in Xing'an province, Soviet forces attacked a Lamaist temple where over 1,000 refugees had gathered. They drove tanks into civilians raising white flags. They raised their rifles. More than 1,000 people died in a single day. It was August 14th. Cyanide was distributed. Explosives were used. People threw themselves into rivers. Parents took the lives of their children before taking their own. Such scenes repeated themselves across Manchuria. Testimony survives of mothers at the banks of the Songhua River who set their infants on the shore before wading into the water. Let at least the children survive. That single prayer gave rise to the history of the war-orphan children left behind in China. The children were left behind in China in many ways. Some lost their parents during the flight. Some survived alone after their families died in mass suicides. Fathers had been taken by the army. Mothers, exhausted and fleeing, had no choice but to leave their children at the roadside. "I'll come back for you. Stay here." Mothers who said those words and could never return. Some children were entrusted out of sheer desperation to keep them fed to Chinese families, placed among adults who spoke only Chinese. These children were raised hiding the fact that they were Japanese. It is estimated that roughly 30% of all settlers perished in this chaos. Approximately 80,000 people. A number comparable to the death toll of the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Settlers made up only 17% of all Japanese in Manchuria. Yet they accounted for nearly half of all deaths. They had been placed in the most remote locations, with the least protection. Soviet troops occupied the territory, preventing repatriation. More than 1 million Japanese were stranded in China. Finally, in May 1946, repatriation ships began departing from Huludeo port. By 1948, 1,050,000 people had returned to Japan. But there were children who could not go home. Approximately 4,000 children remained in China. The Japanese government officially recognized 2,818 war orphans. Many of them raised as Chinese, speaking only Chinese. Were never told they were Japanese. Some only learned they might be Japanese when a neighbor said to them, "Your eyes look Japanese." Such testimony from returned orphans survives. After Japan and China normalized relations in 1972, the search for relatives could finally begin. Japan's official repatriation support program did not start until 1981. Most orphans did not return until the 1980s and 1990s. Nearly 40 years after Japan's defeat. Returning to Japan as Japanese people who could not speak Japanese. They now faced discrimination and isolation within Japanese society. Unable to communicate. A different culture. Unable to find work. Having lived 40 years in China, they were foreigners in both Japan and China. In 2003, 612 former orphans filed a state compensation lawsuit. Why did the government not help us? The courts rejected their claims. But in 2007, the government agreed to provide a living support allowance. In Achi Village, Nagano Prefecture, the Manmo Kaido Peace Memorial Museum opened in 2013. Built in the prefecture that sent the largest number of migrants in the country. It preserves photographs, letters, and personal effects from that era. "Father, I am living here." A line from a letter written, decades later, by a child who could never come home. What did Manchukuo create and what did it destroy? In the 13 years of its existence? For Japan, Manchuria was a lifeline. Iron, coal, soybeans, magnesium. Its abundant resources sustained the war industries and made Japan's continental expansion economically possible. Coal production across Manchuria reached 20 million tons annually by 1941. Steel production expanded rapidly as well. And that prosperity was built on the forced labor of Chinese workers gathered under military compulsion. In northeast China today, memorial facilities documenting the forced labor of the Japanese occupation era exist throughout the region. The word invasion is the official Chinese term for this period. Yet many of the Japanese who came to this land were not politicians or military commanders at the summit of power. They were ordinary people trying to escape rural poverty. They believed the government's lies. They crossed at the government's command. They were abandoned by the government and died. A Chinese political leader once called the war orphans victims of Japanese imperialism, citizens of a nation that inflicted harm, and yet simultaneously victims crushed by the very structures of that nation. Such a paradox runs through this history. How do we tell the story of a history in which perpetrator and victim coexist within the same human being? There may be no right answer. But to remain silent is also a form of dishonesty. Manchuria was a country Japan built and lost. It began through deception. It drew people in through propaganda. It built villages on the land of Chinese farmers. And when defeat came, everything that had been created was left behind. The people who were made to believe, who crossed to the continent, who tilled the earth, who raised their children. They stood on both sides of perpetrator and victim. They crossed as citizens of an invading nation. They died as citizens abandoned by that same nation. Today, nearly all of those who lived this history are gone. The orphans who returned to Japan have grown old. The memories are fading. In this video, we used AI to colorize inanimate historical photographs from that era, adding color to memories that had begun to fade away. If the faces of those who lived on the Manchurian plain feel even a little closer to you, that is enough. Thank you for watching until the end. Your subscription and a like help us make the next video.